Welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate looking into events that matter in the Middle East from multiple angles. This is what many censored media outlets couldn't achieve, and this is why we've come up with this show. Joining us at the studio today is Mr. Jawad Fayrouz, former Bahraini MP. Also with us is Mr. Jonathan Fryer, British politician and writer. We will be joined over the phone later by Dr. Ali Al-Faraj. So let's start our discussion with Mr. Jawad Fayrouz. Mr. Jawad, welcome to the show, first of all.
Thank you.
And you're a well-known opposition figure, ex-MP in Bahrain. And along with the 29 other Bahraini citizens, you had your Bahraini citizenship revoked. The same applied to your brother Jalal Fayrouz, also ex-Bahraini MP. So tell us briefly about the circumstances that led to this, and how could this be assessed from a legal perspective when it comes to revoking someone's citizenship in Bahrain?
Thank you for inviting me in your program, and I think unfortunately this is the case whenever you are living in a dictatorship regime like Bahraini regime, that even you are ex-MP or you are being elected for more than 10 years. For my case, for example, I was elected councillor for 4 years, then MP for more than 6 years. But even though when the uprising in Bahrain started with the Arab Spring, especially in 14 February 2011, a couple of months, I was being detained, tortured, and they took me to the military court. And at the end, I found myself that either I have to be loyal to the regime and accept the dictatorship, or I have to stand with my beliefs and my peoples for their freedom, for the democracy, and so on.
So you had the choice.
I had the choice. And I think in detention center, this was clear that a message from them, either I have to change my position and instead of support the people, support the ruling family and what they are doing and dictatorship, or I have to find the sequences out of it. And I knew from the beginning this is a roadmap that I drew it for myself to continue at the end, stand for my democratic values and beliefs. So they took me to the military court, they took me to the civil court, and earlier they attacked my house twice by cocktail Molotov, and all was the clear messages, but I was resisting all this.
Could you identify the sides? Because I read reports where they were masked people, they were civilians, they weren't even in military uniform or police uniform.
Yes. It was, for example, a clear indication that one torturer was member of the ruling family, because all these soldiers used to call him Sheikh, and it is the title of the ruling family members, that the Sheikh should be from ruling family, that he
a royal family member involved in this.
Yes, clearly.
Abducting a citizen.
It was a military camp, a military prison where I've been taken, been tortured, and he put his gun over my head, and they started beating me, and he threatened me even to put electrical shock if he wants me, you know, to admit that I am agent of Iran, for example, and so on. So at the end, I found out I've been targeted. It happens constantly after I've been freed, and this thanks to the Bassiouni's activities and his team when they came to Bahrain, and they issued their reports, and I've been freed. With the rest, they didn't free me, but just they took my case to the court. And I got a chance to travel here to the UK for just a short visit, where suddenly I heard that they announced in the TV a statement, a single statement announced by the Minister of Interior, that there are 31 citizens, their nationality has been revoked, without any trial, without any evidence, without any reasons. And it was so surprised, because the next day my verdicts of the court was being announced. The court announced that the verdict that I should be in the jail for 15 months, the sentence for 14 months. So it was so contradicting between the verdict of the court and the political decision being taken by the ruling family and the regime, which was a very harsh one, to revoke my nationality. And since then, I am here. And from since then up to now, I am challenging them to give me a single proof. Yes, there is a law in Bahrain, very, very old ones, 1962,
yes,
which is almost organizing the nationality and so on. It limited revoking of the nationality to the certain cases. If you are a part of a military, foreign country's military's organization, or by evidence shows that you become an agent of a foreign country or so on, or by evidence shown that you are a threat to the security of the state. Nothing of this being proven. So it was so clear that it was a political tools misused by the regime just to threat the opposition.
Jonathan Fryer, what do you have to say about that? The UK supports and is perhaps the biggest seller of weapons to Gulf countries, yet at the same time they did offer asylum to Mr. Fayrouz and his brother.
Yes, there is a certain ambiguity in the relationship, certainly, between London and Manama, because on the one hand, as you say, Britain is a large exporter of weapons and to the Gulf, including Bahrain, but we have offered hospitality to opponents of the Bahraini regime for many years now. Mr. Fayrouz is one of the more recent and celebrated members, but there are many others. It's interesting, often when there's a Bahrain National Day celebration, there are usually some Bahraini demonstrators outside protesting about it. This whole issue of nationality is fascinating because, of course, in principle, in international law, you should not revoke the nationality and make someone stateless unless there is some extremely important thing, for example, participation in a terrorist act or something like that. So it is very serious. And on the other hand, the fascinating thing is that Bahrain is the one Gulf country that actually offers nationality to people from other places. This was partly to try to redress the balance, because the population is majority Shia, the ruling family is Sunni, and they were giving nationality to some long-time residents, Pakistani members of the BDS, the security force, and others, to try to redress that balance. So they're using nationality.
Does that violate the international law by offering nationality to someone else?
No, other countries do it, but it's unique in the Gulf. In other countries such as Kuwait, it's almost impossible to get Kuwaiti nationality.
Kuwait did offer nationality to Palestinian stateless people, actually, especially the Baradei family, Christian families from Palestine.
Yes, indeed,
they do that, but not as often, of course.
See, there are statistics show that less than 10 years, between 60 to more than 120,000 people being given Bahrain nationality, and they are coming from the countries where the conflict is very high, in a way that they are armed and they are violent people. Yes, I'm agreeing with you that it's part of it to change the democratic groups of the people, and they think that with that one, they let the opposition become a minority instead of being a majority.
We will speak to Dr. Ali Faraj now, joining us over the phone. But before that, inspired by the regional Arab Spring, Bahrain's Shia majority started large protests against the Sunni rulers in early 2011. So, Jonathan Fryer, why do you think it was all basically, democracy is not only about minority rights and minority balance? What went wrong, do you think, in Bahrain? Before we get Dr. Ali Faraj over the phone, so we'd like to have some of your input.
I mean, I think it's clear that basically what is at the basis of all the protests and activities since is power, and who has power, and how particularly the Shia majority was excluded from many aspects of political life, even economic life. The Shia villages and Maharak are much poorer than many of the other communities in Bahrain. And on the one hand, yes, Bahrain offered a bit of democracy. It has a parliament, it has elections.
Women can vote.
Indeed. And there were demonstrations. I've watched, as a journalist, reported on demonstrations in Manama at various times. But it would seem that a more hardline element within the ruling family and its advisors eventually decided enough is enough, and they clamped down. And there was a very clear conflict within the ruling family, and the hardliners won. And they used the bogeyman of an alleged Iranian involvement, therefore, to invoke a clause in the Gulf Cooperation Council agreement, which meant they could call in troops from Saudi Arabia and other countries on the pretext that they were under threat from a foreign power.
That's for sure. Let's talk now to Dr. Ali Al-Faraj joining us over the phone. Dr. Al-Faraj, welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you very much, and my regards to your guest, Jawad and Jonathan.
Thank you. Initially, the government of Bahrain supposedly allowed protests despite an early morning raid on protesters who camped in Pearl Roundabout on the 15th of February 2011. Dr. Al-Faraj, do you think by showing tolerance towards the protesters and allowing them to protest, did the Bahraini government here, has it showed signs of weakness, or has it actually weakened its own position by allowing these protests, which later on gained momentum? Why do you think they got weakened by that, and why?
Well, basically the regime, the Al-Khalifa regime, because it's a weak regime in the Gulf, and most of the people in Bahrain, they are actually not in support of the regime. So they were confused, basically, in the initial stage. They didn't know what to do, and they were trying to seek approval for any action from the Americans and from the Saudis. And during the period before the invasion of Bahrain by the Saudi forces, the regime has actually fallen in terms of it wasn't controlling the capital Manama, so it was very weak then. Mm-hmm. And then when it got the approval and the Saudi army came inside Bahrain and Bahrain became occupied, then obviously the crackdown happened. But despite that, the revolution now is very strong now, and it's continuing despite the crackdown that happens regularly. And this is now the fourth year of the revolution, and the revolution hasn't shown any weakness. So, and in a political position that is very strong now, the opposition hasn't surrendered to the government, is still continuing with the demands of the people of Bahrain, and the demands of the people of Bahrain are legitimate demands. The ruling family in Bahrain has been ruling for over 200 years, 230 years, and has made all sorts of problems in the country in terms of discrimination against the majority of the people. There are almost some ministries in the government that are empty of the majority of the people of Bahrain. There are all sorts of problems in terms of political naturalization of people from outside to change the demography of the country. So there are all sorts of problems. Despite that, and in addition to that, obviously, the occupation of the country and giving the political power to a foreign power, which is the Saudi power, to have an upper hand in the country and its politics. So people in Bahrain, they have no voice in such a regime, and this is the main problem why the revolution started.
Dr. Al-Faraj, it's a similar rule in Kuwait and even in Qatar, in the UAE. So why Bahrain? What was the fueling element? We know very well that it was a little bit of a sectarian motive there between the Shia and a minority of Sunni rulers being on the monarchy.
Well, basically, Bahrain is different from the Gulf country. I mean, it's similar to other Gulf countries in terms of the presence of limited democracy. I mean, Kuwait has a better. They have a parliament, and they have other GCC states. They have been, although there isn't democracy in these countries, but that the regimes they haven't gone so far with the discrimination against the majority of the people. They haven't obviously there are violations of human rights in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, but they haven't done these violations to the degree that there are Bahraini citizens are not allowed to live in certain cities in the country. It's like an apartheid state. So there are all sorts of violations in Bahrain that made the people of Bahrain to decide for the revolution. The other thing is that the political naturalization of people coming from outside gave the signal to the people of Bahrain that this regime wants to change the demography, and they will be marginalized. And it's a matter of existence, a matter of identity of the people of Bahrain. And this is the reason why the revolution in Bahrain has been, and the uprising has been the strongest in the Gulf region.
Mm-hmm. Can I get Jonathan Fryer here with us at the studio, maybe to talk a little bit about the sectarian motives in Bahrain? And if you can stay with us on the line, of course, and you're welcome to engage with him.
Well, certainly Bahrain is unique in the Gulf in that it has a majority Shia population. And certainly if one goes into Shia mosques, as I've done in Bahrain, you will often see portraits of the Ayatollah Khomeini and other Shia figures. But I think it would be wrong to see this entirely as a sectarian conflict. It's been portrayed by that very often by the media and by some of the people in power. But it is much more about the majority of the population who feel that they have the right, or should have the right, to a share in the country's wealth and in the power, and to have opportunities in jobs of various kinds which they don't have. And there isn't really a sectarian conflict in the sense of a religious conflict in Bahrain. There are political conflict, which happens to be largely, but not entirely by any means, between two different branches of Islam.
Jawad Fayrouz?
Yes, just a small comment. I believe Bahrain's regime is unique in the world in a way that combine all these negative characteristics in any dictatorship regime. It exists in this regime. If I can list it: dictatorship, applying discrimination, applying the naturalization, applying the torture and continuing torture as systematic torture, applying clearly apartheid or cleansing nowadays, continuing that the entire the world in the hand of the ruling family, the majority, social majority becoming now a minority in the country and in the world one, feeding the sectarians and all this, inviting a foreign country to come and invade the country and crack down the majority uprising in the country. All this happened, if you can list them, never happened in any regime in the world.
You're talking about inviting Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia is clearly that mentions revoking the nationality of the opposition, using armed forces to crack down any type of the uprising. So all this combination shows that something wrong, and this is affecting the stability, not just stability of Bahrain, this is splitting of the region. And it's been so clear, this regime, because they follow up a wrong direction to impose a ruling family with a cosmetic type of the reform, not a serious reform. I've been elected a councillor, I didn't have much power to rule all the decision of the municipality councillor. I became an MP, my limited was to make better services and better financial income of the people.
Did you get to do that? Did you get to?
Just to this limited, but we couldn't make any changes in the political life. We couldn't have more room for the people to share the power. We couldn't question seriously a ruling family or putting them. Everyone knows. None of the ruling family been taken to the court up to now, or been tried and so on. Sure. So we don't have independent judiciary, we don't have a representative councillor or representative of elected legislation body, and we don't have clear elected government. So all this shows that without a core changes, without a serious reform in Bahrain, definitely it will affect the instability in the Gulf, which at the end it will be a negative impact of this strategical location to continue to be stable.
Just before we finish this section, I would like to get back quickly to Dr. Ali Al-Faraj before you leave us this evening. Mr. Jawad Fayrouz spoke about political rights as a politician and as a minority group, someone who's not from the royal family, yet in politics. As an MD in your profession, as in your capacity as a psychiatrist, Talk to me about, tell us more about individual rights in Bahrain. How does having the Al Khalifa for centuries, a couple of centuries in rule, in power, affect the individual Bahrainis' morale in general, so that for all of them to go to Pearl Square and protest and want a different regime completely, want a real democracy in the country?
Basically, the problem in Bahrain is that people in the ruling family, they have been brought up in a way that they are like they are the landlords, they are everything in the country, and they own the country, and people are like slaves for them.
Are you talking about Al Khalifa here?
Sorry?
Are you talking about Al Khalifa?
Yes.
Okay.
They were brought up like they are the landlords, and they're the owner of the country, and the rest of the people are just slaves. And they rule in this way, with this mentality. And for that reason, people in Bahrain, they don't feel they have dignity inside Bahrain, because anyone from their own family, like if someone is killed by someone from their own family, the perpetrator, the killer, wouldn't be taken to an ordinary court, and he might be sentenced for a year or two only by the ruling council in the. So people are not dealt with. People have no dignity, and their rights can be violated at any time. What Mr. Fayrouz described of torture and inhuman treatment is just an example of that. That people could be taken from their own homes without orders from courts and be tortured, and not just in the last few days, they arrested children like 7 or 8 or 9 years old, and a woman as well from her home without any orders from court, with anything.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Faraj.
Terrorize the population.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Al-Faraj. You are most welcome to continue watching this debate. Thank you very much again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back, and let's look now at very recent events in the GCC, with a major shift of the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, where all three states called their ambassadors in Qatar. Let's start by having a quick review with this short report.
Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates have withdrawn their ambassadors from Qatar after alleging that it has been meddling in their internal affairs. A joint statement said Qatar had failed to implement a security accord signed last year stipulating non-interference. On the other hand, Qatar expressed its regret and surprise at the move and said it would not withdraw its envoys. Tensions between the Emirate and other Gulf Cooperation Council members have increased in recent years. The statement said the three countries had made major efforts to convince Qatar to implement a November 2013 agreement not to back anyone threatening the security and stability of the GCC. Qatar, according to its Gulf members, has failed to comply, and the recall of the ambassadors from Doha was therefore necessary to ensure security and stability. Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Bahrain have been calling for increased military and diplomatic union within the sixth nation GCC, which also includes Oman and Kuwait. However, Qatar and Oman have so far resisted increased integration in these fields.
Dramatic scenes there in our report. Anti-Saudi programs broadcast by Qatar's Al Jazeera TV were seen as one of the major reasons for Riyadh's decision to withdraw its ambassador to Qatar as early as 2008. Jonathan Fryer, to what extent could this be the case, and when does media play a part in delivering messages and perhaps become an alternative to orthodox diplomacy between two states?
Well, certainly Al Jazeera has, from the point of view of the Saudis, been a huge irritant. The Saudis like to control what is seen in Saudi Arabia and would ideally like to control what is seen throughout the Arab world. It was interesting, for example, BBC Arabic television, when it first started, was on a Saudi satellite, but had to, that ended after a while. So, in a sense, the Sheikh Hamad, the last ruler who abdicated in Qatar, took an enormous gamble vis-à-vis the rest of the GCC by sponsoring and indeed paying for a lot of Al Jazeera, and then inviting them to do stories which no other television channel based in the Gulf could possibly do. And this was hugely annoying to the Saudis. There is anyway a long-standing rivalry between Qatar and Saudi. They're very similar in many ways, but the Qataris have been following a completely different path. And of course, they have modernized to a degree that Saudi hasn't. And they are setting Doha up as a center for intellectual debate, for universities from all over the world, opening up and, of course, challenging Saudi's very jealously guarded role as the most important country in the Gulf.
It is the biggest country, so...
It is the biggest, and it's always taken that for granted. And Qatar is a bit like the sort of new upstart who, much, much smaller, but per capita the richest country in the world, and has been very, very clever at the way they have used that money and use their diplomatic
Is it
clout
clever to use money to fuel tensions in a region that has done very well? Basically, they had goodwill amongst the GCC states since 1981, while compared, for example, to the UAE and using their wealth, and like you said, you used the term clever, they used it to boost their economy, their infrastructure, their even tourism, and their relations with the world. So how clever is Qatar's usage of its own wealth?
Well, it's clever in the sense that they have turned this country, which, when it first started on the modernization path, had less than 500,000 population, into a major player in international diplomacy, not just in the Middle East, but beyond, by, for example, successfully bidding also for the World Cup and hosting numerous international meetings, gatherings, conferences, etc. And Sheikh Hamad in particular was very, very at the forefront, really, on all sorts of issues, for example, on the Palestine question, doing a great deal to support international efforts. And so Qatar has really made its mark. And of course has been very wise in the way it's invested a lot of its money. It hasn't just spent it, it has now got enormous resources based in the major Western economies, including in Europe.
Definitely major investments in Europe, especially France, the UK and the likes. Yet again, what's in it for Qatar in Mali, for example, to support Islamist factions?
Obviously the
that's not even the Arab world
no, it isn't. And we might say from here it's difficult to see what the diplomatic advantages of that could be. But certainly the Qataris have supported, not only in Mali, but of course much more famously in Syria, supported groups which it feels are deserving support as groups which are essentially Islamist and which are fighting against either a regime which is secular or else another group which they don't particularly approve of. And that in a sense is the downside. I wouldn't claim that is why Qatar has managed to be so successful internationally. On the contrary, it's despite that.
Let's see what Mr. Jawad Fayrouz has to say about Qatar's role, particularly in the region.
I believe since the previous Emir Hamad came in power, I think it was certain type of the mutual understanding and backing by the United States to little bit prepare the Arab world for the changes could be maintained that the current regime, maybe they are declining somehow, either ruling families or current governments. So I think slowly they depend on the Qatari wealth and consider to be as a base to gradually for spreading certain type of the democracy or backing certain type of the oppositions can have a popular friends in a way that they are having the majority, especially, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood started with them because at any time, if there's any change going to be, they're going to have the majority of the people in the support. And beside that one, I think because the Al Saud, they couldn't maintain the changes within themselves. They became so static, and the way they supported certain fanatics and hardliners and lead to this 9/11, where there it was a turn point to the American policy that time comes now to redesign the Middle East, mainly in the Arabic world. And I think that was the chance where spark started in Tunisia. And here, I think somehow the Al Thani, mainly Hamad bin Jabir Jassim, who was foreign minister and prime minister, he tried to redesign it. And I think it's part of the American policy to find a new power to become and lead either the Sunni groups or to lead the Arabic in a way that to have a democratic type of the governments. And here the conflict comes between the power of Al Saud, who thought that the Islamic world in their hand, especially the Sunni groups, and at the same time they can maintain their power beyond the border of the Saudi Arabia, which was in conflict of the new born body within the Muslim Brotherhood and feeded strongly by Qataris, and somehow they felt that American administration is behind it and they are feeding it.
Well, moving from Qatari interests in the region and, like you said, trying to gain more Sunni support, be it the Muslim Brotherhood or its associated factions, let's talk about the contrasting views in the GCC. Despite calling its Qatar envoy, the UAE, particularly Dubai, wants sanctions on Iran lifted. And would you probably agree this is hardly surprising given that nearly 500,000 Iranians live in the UAE and that Dubai already benefits from a flourishing trade with Iran. So how could the UAE maintain its relations with fellow GCC states, especially Saudi Arabia, who is not in a state of rapprochement with Iran and even views Iran as a strategic threat? So there's a big difference there between the stances of the UAE and Iran. And Qatar, sorry.
Yeah, UAE dealing with Iran in two different opposite ways. In economical way, they are in favor more that Iran to invest in UAE, and we all knows that the Dubai becomes so rich after the break of the Iraq-Iran war, where Iranian found it is a base for them to try to make it as a transit location with the international world that they can make a trade transaction and so on. When there was complete ban over Iran,
yes.
They use it at Dubai as a base.
It is the gateway in the Middle East, Dubai.
So economically, it is in favor of Dubai and UAE that Iran and Dubai, they're going to have a mutual interest between. Politically, it is opposite totally, because they're afraid that Iranian expansion politically, it will be opposite to the interests of the Saudi Arabia and opposite to the stability of UAE, because it is a tribal type of the government, non-elected, and because Iranian usually they are supporting certain type of reforms and elected government and so on. So I think politically it is in opposite. But
and religiously, maybe even
religiously, yes, but they are not much afraid because there are no, because there are no Shia in UAE much, and Bahrain is this is the other point, that Bahrain is becoming conflict with Iran mainly because the majority of the opposition are Shia, and they are afraid that they can be more loyal to Iran and affect the stability of Bahrain.
I would maybe address a similar question to you, Jonathan. How could the UAE maintain its relationships with GCC neighbors, especially Saudi, who's not interested in any rapprochement with Iran?
Well, it will maintain its relationship, but I think it's absolutely true that the shine has gone off the GCC. A few years ago, the 6 states were moving towards a currency union, greater cooperation on all sorts of fields. And it's been interesting over the last 3 years since the beginning of the so-called Arab awakening or Arab Spring.
Why do you say so-called?
Well, because it's a phrase which is used. I prefer the phrase Arab awakening to Arab Spring, mainly because it was quite clear right from the beginning it would last much longer than a season of 1 year. I think it would last 10 years or more before it plays its way through. But it was very clear over the last 3 years that the interests of individual Gulf states have diverged on a number of issues politically, including in international relations, and their differences have started to show more clearly. Of course, one of the reasons Saudi Arabia is so nervous about unrest, and particularly in Bahrain, is that in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia there is a Shia population, and there were the beginnings of an uprising, an Arab Spring type uprising in the eastern province, which was very quickly sat on very hard by the Saudi authorities. Now, you don't have that sort of situation in UAE at all. UAE is developing in a very different way, and particularly Dubai.
Could Qatar not have followed Dubai in this different way, like you said?
Well, they were determined to have their USP, their unique selling point, which is to make Qatar a modern, international, open...
Do you sell well when you promote Islamism and when you promote the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or when you promote Islamist groups in Mali and in Syria, which will be coming in the next section? How modern is that? How appealing is that to Westerners like yourself?
There is a certain contradiction, but that's not the thing that they're emphasizing with the Westerners.
But that's the brand now.
I'm not sure whether it is for most people in the West. I think in London, if you ask them what do you know about Qatar, it would be the World Cup, it would be Al Jazeera.
Thanks to Jazeera, yes, of course.
And things of that kind. And I mean, to their credit, if you go to Qatar, you have a situation, all Qataris are well off. You go to Bahrain, not all Bahrainis are well off. In Bahrain, there
that
are
doesn't mean they're
communities.
democratic. That doesn't mean they're modern.
But it means that they, in general, Qataris are content. They realize that they have the highest standard of living in the world. They can travel where they want. And
everyone will be content, I think, when you've got all the benefits and the perks of it.
But the Al Thani's have been shrewd. They've made sure everybody did.
They're more rich. We can't compare Bahrain to the wealth of Qatar in that sense.
But remember, I mean, the reason that Bahrain didn't join the UAE when the UAE was created after the end of the British control was because Bahrain was the richest and it thought it ought to have the more power than the others, and therefore it stayed out. Bahrain has gone down since, but it was absolutely the leader. It was the first to discover oil on that side of the Gulf. It benefited very well from the pearl trade. And so the Al Khalifas had the opportunity to share the wealth, like the Al Sabahs in Kuwait, but they didn't.
My other question goes to you, Mr. Fayrouz. A Qatari citizen received a 7-year jail sentence in the UAE for supporting an Islamist political society known by Al-Islah, which prosecutors assert is a local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt.
Yes.
Now, back to Qatar, also seen as a major financial and diplomatic supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's no secret, an organization which is banned in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Mr. Fayrouz, do you think that Qatar was trying to support Islamist groups like Al-Islah? Why do you think they're supporting these groups? We will get back to supporting groups in Syria in the next section, but why in the Gulf states? Why are they doing that?
I think there's a belief in these Gulf states, especially in Saudi Arabia and UAE, there is a conspiracy against them, fed behind the scene by United States. And the player are two. Muslim Brotherhood, because they are most dominant and organized, and they have very elites among them, political elites and so on, and they are big threat to UAE mainly and Saudi Arabia. And then secondly, because they are backed by a wealthy, very, very wealthy country like Qatar. So they are so suspicious about it. And meantime, as I said earlier, because Saudi Arabia still they want to maintain to be a main power who are controlling the Islamic world, and they look suspicious of any Islamic groups that they are growing up maintaining financial aid. In the same time, they are becoming a political power. So fastly they supported the coup or counter-revolution, you can say, in Egypt, and they want that to minimize any spread of the Brotherhood expansion. As we know, the Tunisia Brotherhood, they get power. Already they are in Turkey, and they started to become active in Syria, and somehow the threat is becoming closer to the Saudi Arabia's border. So in advance, UAE took that action, and they detained all the activists from Islah who are part of the Muslim Brotherhood and whoever is part of them, and they thought that the Qatari are feeding these type of the activities through their citizens, and they said that there was a certain type of the institution that called democratic or a democratic change in the Arab world to be upgrade and try to raise certain elites through that one, and this was in Qatar. They said this is part of the source of the threat to them. So in total, because there was a struggle of power, and they thought that initially their policy to be in a way that's the maintaining the power of Saudi Arabia, not to lead that the rest of the international world countries to interfere in the.
What do you think, Mr. Fryer, about this, about Qatar's interfering in neighbors, fellow members of the GCC by supporting Islamism within the GCC?
Well, certainly it is irritating the Saudis and one or two of the other GCC states, but they clearly feel that it is in their interest to have good connections with these groups and to show that they are not just another royal authoritarian government, such as either Saudi or Bahrain.
So we will move now to our next section after this short break. And now we will look at the GCC stance over Qatar from a strategic security angle and discuss possible scenarios. But before that, let's have a look at this brief analysis of what led to high regional security concerns.
BBC security correspondent Frank Gardner analyzes the calling of the ambassadors, saying the strains between Qatar and some of its more conservative Gulf neighbours have finally broken the surface. What lies behind this is a growing conviction felt in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi and Manama that Qatar is unwilling to end its alleged support for Islamist and extremist groups in the region. The Saudi believe Qatar is arming the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, a jihadist rebel group linked to Al-Qaeda. Qatar is also accused of supporting Houthi rebels in Yemen and the now banned Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Gulf sources say the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim al-Thani, had promised to change his country's foreign policies to align more closely with its neighbours. Gardner concludes, clearly the Gulf more conservative bloc remain unconvinced and have hinted at still tougher measures if the disputed goes unresolved.
Riyadh, Abu Dhabi and Bahrain are highly concerned that Qatar is unwilling to end its alleged support for Islamist and extremist groups in the region. Let's touch a bit on Syria with you, Jonathan Fryer. You visit Qatar frequently, you go to Doha. Tell us more about Qatar's proxies in Syria.
Well, certainly there are groups that the British government in particular has certain concerns over, but on the other hand...
Only now, maybe?
Indeed, but on the other hand, they're on, in a sense, the right side as far as the West is concerned. This is one of the central paradoxes of the situation in Syria, that the conservative Gulf states have been supporting a number of different groups in the military action against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and of course politically Western Europe and the United States also opposes Bashar al-Assad. So there is this certain ambiguity in that relationship, and clearly they're not groups that the British government would wish to support, but Qatar has decided that this is in the interest and justified if they can get rid of Bashar al-Assad, though that is looking increasingly unlikely.
So the means justify, the end justifies the means, basically, even if as a state Qatar had to deal with factions associated with terrorist activities.
Yes, indeed, because in that sort of conflict, when you have a civil war, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and therefore we can make moral judgments about it. I suppose these days, after 3 years of the conflict now, and worsening conflict, with well over 140,000 people dead, the most urgent thing now is to try to come to some sort of negotiated settlement that would at least end the killing, because this is now reaching a preposterous, dreadful humanitarian proportions, not only of the dead, but of the millions of refugees and the destruction of the country. It's absolutely tragic. I was there when it all started in March 2011, And it's been horrific to watch how it has completely spiraled out of control.
Couldn't we say that if Qatar stopped its support to the rebel factions in Syria, then the crisis will come to an end eventually, while the regime might gain momentum, of course, which Qatar doesn't seem to encourage at all. But then if we're really concerned about the crisis per se, then stopping support of the insurgents would really be half the problem solved.
Well, it might shorten the war. It's difficult to say exactly, but I don't think we should have any illusions about the Assad regime. It had a long history of human rights abuses. It was very intolerant of opponents. That was the case when Hafiz Assad was in power, and indeed Bashir and the people around him, who are the really hardline ones.
Is Qatar in a position to enforce reform in the region, while human rights are not particularly very well off in Qatar itself?
Well, Qatar is not perfect. No country in the Gulf, or indeed the wider Arab world, is perfect.
So what's the interest in Syria? Why do they have an agenda in Syria when it comes to... Do you think it's human rights based, their intervention in Syria?
No, not really. I mean, I think obviously there is an element that they are worried that there is this so-called crescent of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the growing influence that had been identified by Western security services and by the Saudis and others, and therefore initially there was certainly support for their backing to certain opposition groups.
So it's a strategic backing
absolutely.
as well. So, perfect. Let's move on, staying in Qatar actually, and staying with you, Jonathan Fryer. A book by Nicolas Beau and Jacques-Marie Bourguet tells us more about its writers' impressions. Its writers are French, of Qatar. They refer to Qatar in their title, Le Vilain Petit Qatar, or Qatar, the Little Villain. Mr. Fryer, where can we say that Qatar is a nation's friend that wishes it harm, be it an Arab nation or a European nation? These are not our words, of course. It's the title of the book.
Indeed, it is the theme of the book. I mean, the book essentially is a counter-narrative to the Qatari official narrative that Qatar is open to the world, is basically liberalizing on many areas, and is a force for good. Mm-hmm. These two authors who are journalists, well-known journalists in the French press, basically argue that Qatar has been using its money to buy not only property but stakes in foreign companies, and they argue, it's their argument, not mine, by foreign politicians and other people in power by inviting them to Doha for very comfortable visits and other favors. They're very generous to people that they work with, and according to the two French journalists, this in fact is an insidious attempt to win and therefore control politicians and economies.
Mr. Fayrouz might have something to say about that, but before that you mentioned alliances between the Qataris and European politicians, regardless of who they were. Can we compare this a little bit to General Gaddafi's friends in Europe, one of them being ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair?
Yes, of course, that strange network of friends, including Mr. Blair, was just
Why is it strange?
Well, it was strange because it was against everything that had happened for 35 years, and then there was a period of about 5 years when suddenly Libya, having been a pariah and having been subject to sanctions, suddenly was very popular, of course, largely because of its oil, and people like Mr. Blair were going out there, and Gaddafi, instead of giving money to finance various terrorist groups, was prepared to contribute to other causes and indeed to stop work on weapons of mass destruction. But it's rather a different case.
Definitely, we're just comparing here the stance there. We're not discussing Libya, of course. Mr. Jawad Fayrouz, tell us more. When does Qatar become a friend that wishes harm in the Arab world, a friend to the GCC neighbors, a friend for Syria, but at the same time wishing it harm indirectly. Tell us of
As a
this.
short answer, I think you have to dig to see what is the American policy in this regard. I don't believe that Qataris by themselves are planning and they are acting. Somehow they are doing certain role is being planned by the United States. You never find a contradict or a conflict between the Qatari's policy in the Middle East and United States.
It used to be Saudi Arabia before.
Yes,
didn't it?
yes. But when the Saudis, as I said, they reached a static level and they started, Americans, I think, they found a solid reasons and a solid evidence that Saudis as a ruling family are supporting a terrorist group behind the attacks on 9/11, what happens with Qaeda, and later on the rest of it, and it's becoming a direct threat. So I think it's become like a diversion point that they have to find another local power who's gonna have a very good wealth that they can implement and try to spread the policy, not as a direct involvement of American. They can plan it behind the scene, and the role going to be given to another Arab country, and I think Qatar is played well. So it is not matter of supporting a democratic process. It is matter of supporting anywhere where the government and the regime is opposing the United States policy. And here comes why Qataris didn't support the uprising in Bahrain, for example. Okay, Americans, they wanted some changes, but not to go full level to pull up the ruling family regime and so on. So they wanted to be certain level, certain pressure to make certain changes. So I think that invasion, for example, of Saudi troops in Bahrain was under the umbrella of Britain and United States. And in this whole process, Qatar has become so silent. But we could find so much involvement in the struggle in Libya or in Egypt or in Syria later on. But when they found it out that this policy will feeding more radical groups who are becoming a terrorist group, then they sit back, but Saudis, they're going to go further through the Bandar bin Sultan, who was a pioneer of how to manage it, and it was opposing the American policy, how to deal with it, because the threat of these radical groups become more threat to the West more than the Bashar Assad itself. So they pull it back and let the Bashar to do his job. Now what we are seeing now, they become weaker and Bashar has become more powerful.
Speaking of Qatar's relation with the West, particularly the US and the UK and EU, of course, I had a very quick sneak peek at one of your reports there titled Like Father, Like Son. Do you think there was a big preference here in the West to deal with Sheikh Tamim, the Prince of Qatar, rather than Sheikh Hamad, his father?
Okay, still it is not so clear why the father stepped down and let his son to become in power. But part of it, I can say that the policy which is run now by the Tamim is same policy as was his father was running.
A larger affinity to the West.
Okay, but because a new diversion started, and part of it was the struggle in Syria, and it's required a new faces and new policy, it will not work with the previous regime was led by the father. So you should change the faces that you come with new policy. And let me go back that this was part of the struggle what ended to this confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, because Qatar, they wanted to make a change, and Qatar, they wanted to go back once again to reshuffle the case, but Saudis, they want to continue, and this is part of the differences. But let me end up here. Is very important that it is so important that we keep the Gulf area to be stable. And this stability doesn't mean it should be part of the interests of certain conflict powers. It shouldn't be part of the interests of Iranian and opposing the interests of the West of Saudi Arabia, and at the same time, in opposite way, it shouldn't be part of the interests of the Western and Saudi Arabia and become threat to the Iran. And this is the case currently, unfortunately. It could be a base of the mutual interest of all these countries. It could be a mutual base of interest of Iranians, West, and Saudi Arabia. And I think easily we can find and reach a formula, political, economical formula, that here the stability can maintain and security that everyone gonna gain, not everyone gonna lose. Unfortunately, now that the struggle is going in a way that everyone is losing. I think Americans are losing, Saudi Arabians are losing, the people themselves of the Gulf are losing, Iranians somehow becoming a threat of it. We have to think now, the time comes, find it in opposite way that everyone is gaining in this region.
Jonathan Fryer, before we wrap up very briefly, Riyadh's fears of Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps looking to export their Islamic revolution across the Gulf. Saudi has seen that support in Syria, and I'm talking about the Iranian support in Syria, and Saudi is now concerned should the Bahraini opposition gain momentum. It has even expressed anger over the interim nuclear deal that has been signed recently with Iran. So my question is, can we say that this whole agree but not on all terms rhetoric amongst the GCC members is partly because of Iran is being the regional power that has a totally different ideology? That's the first part. And while Dubai, for instance, managed to maintain good relations and, if I may say, this political goodwill with Iran, why does Saudi Arabia fail to do so? Is the Wahhabi element there the main variance?
I don't think it is necessarily the Wahhabism that is the main variance, though obviously there are very real doctrinal differences between Shia Islam as practiced in the Islamic Republic of Iran and Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia. But we have to realize that Saudi and Iran are the two big players in the region. They're the two rivals in the region for influence. And it's very interesting that UAE, in a sense, is caught between the two. And they've realized that it's in their interest to, while being part of the GCC, nonetheless, to be relatively friendly towards Iran and to be much more complimentary about the possible nuclear deal than has been the case of some of the other GCC countries. Because, in a sense, they don't know how things are going to develop in the future. Saudi Arabia may seem like a bastion of stability, but those of us who've been following it for a long time realize that actually Saudi Arabia itself is deeply vulnerable to some sort of internal upset that would see the end of the House of Saud. And in that case, Iran would be in a prime position to be the top dog.
So what about Qatar? Do you think Qatar is very stable? You mentioned that Saudi Arabia, while it is confident that it is a major player there and it's very safe and stable politically, what about Qatar, whose ego seems to be bigger than its...
Well, Qatar's stability is based on its gas revenues in particular. It has got enough there to keep it going for probably quite a long time. But it's been very interesting to see how Sheikh Hamad, who of course overthrew his father, handed over to Tamim and also promoted his daughter, Mayasa, his wife, and others, and have broadened out the share of power and the share of influence.
Sharing power by
getting
within the family.
Within the family.
Within the family.
But
so.
By Gulf standards, that's relatively progressive.
Well, okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan Fryer. Let's have a quick wrap-up of today's episode. We touched on the background and what went wrong in Bahrain. We then moved to the issues between Qatar and the particularities of Qatar. We spoke to Dr. Ali Al-Faraj, who had his input about the individual Bahraini and how they would feel under the Al Khalifa rule, where not everyone has equal access in the small country. And we spoke, of course, to ex-MP Mr. Jawad Fayrouz, who told us about the scene, how he was taken in captive and now living in the UK in asylum. And at least you have your state. You were a stateless person at first, but now, of course, you're over that. But we do hope that you will be back in Bahrain soon. Thank you very much for joining Straightforward. And for more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Gulf country that actually offers nationality to people from other places. This was partly to try to redress the balance, because the population is majority Shia, the ruling family is Sunni, and they were giving nationality to some long-time residents, Pakistani members of the BDS, the security force, and others, to try to redress that balance. So they're using nationality.
Does that violate the
way.
international law by offering nationality to someone
No,
else?
other countries do it, but it's unique in the Gulf. In other countries such as Kuwait, it's almost impossible to get Kuwaiti nationality.
Kuwait did offer nationality to Palestinian stateless people, actually, especially the Baradei family. Christian families from Palestine.
Yes, indeed,
they do that, but not as often, of course.
Recently.
See, there are statistics show that less than 10 years, between 60 to more than 120,000 people being given Bahrain nationality, and they are coming from the countries where the conflict is very high, in a way that they are armed and they are violent people. Yes, I'm agreeing with you that it's part of it to change the democratic groups of the people, and they think that with that one, they let the opposition become a minority instead of being a majority.
We will speak to Dr. Ali Faraj now, joining us over the phone. But before that, inspired by the regional Arab Spring, Bahrain's Shia majority started large protests against the Sunni rulers in early 2011. So, Jonathan Fryer, why do you think it was all basically, democracy is not only about minority rights and minority balance? What went wrong, do you think, in Bahrain? Before we get Dr. Ali Faraj over the phone, so we'd like to have some of your input.
I mean, I think it's clear that basically what is at the basis of all the protests and activities since is power, and who has power, and how.
Between the verdict of the court and the political decision being taken by the ruling family and the regime, which was a very harsh one, to revoke my nationality. And since then, I am here. And from since then up to now, I am challenging them to give me a single proof. Yes, there is a law in Bahrain, very, very old ones, 1962,
yes,
which is almost organizing the nationality and so on. It limited revoking of the nationality to the certain cases. If you are a part of a military, foreign country's military's organization, or by evidence shows that you become an agent of a foreign country or so on, or by evidence shown that you are a threat to the security of the state. Nothing of this being proven. So it was so clear that it was a political tools misused by the regime just to threat the opposition.
Jonathan Fryer, what do you have to say about that? The UK supports and is perhaps the biggest seller of weapons to Gulf countries, yet at the same time they did offer asylum to Mr. Fayrouz and his brother.
Yes, there is a certain ambiguity in the relationship, certainly, between London and Manama, because on the one hand, as you say, Britain is a large exporter of weapons to the Gulf, including Bahrain, but we have offered hospitality to opponents of the Bahraini regime for many years now. Mr. Fayrouz is one of the more recent and celebrated members, but there are many others. It's interesting, often when there's a Bahrain National Day celebration, there are usually some Bahraini demonstrators outside protesting about it. This whole issue of nationality is fascinating because, of course, in principle, in international law, you should not revoke the nationality and make someone stateless unless there is some extremely important thing, for example, participation in a terrorist act or something like that. So it is very serious. And on the other hand, the fascinating thing is that Bahrain is the one particularly the Shia majority, was excluded from many aspects of political life, even economic life. The Shia villages and Maharak are much poorer than many of the other communities in Bahrain. And on the one hand, yes, Bahrain offered a bit of democracy. It has a parliament, it has elections.
Women
and
can
therefore,
vote.
Indeed. And there were demonstrations. I've watched as a journalist, reported on demonstrations in Manama at various times. But it would seem that a more hardline element within the ruling family and its advisors eventually decided enough is enough, and they clamped down. And there was a very clear conflict within the ruling family, and the hardliners won. And they used the bogeyman of an alleged Iranian involvement, therefore to invoke a clause in the Gulf Cooperation Council agreement, which meant they could call in troops from Saudi Arabia and other countries on the pretext that they were under threat from a foreign power.
That's for sure. Let's talk now to Dr. Ali Al-Faraj, joining us over the phone. Dr. Al-Faraj, welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you very much, and my regards to your guest, Jawad and Jonathan.
Thank you. Initially, the government of Bahrain supposedly allowed protests despite an early morning raid on protesters who camped in Pearl Roundabout on the 15th of February 2011. Dr. Al-Faraj, do you think by showing tolerance towards the protesters and allowing them to protest, did the Bahraini government here, has it showed signs of weakness, or has it actually weakened its own position by allowing these protests, which later on gained momentum? Why do you think they got weakened by that, and why?
Well, basically the regime, the Al-Khalifa regime, because it's a weak regime in the Gulf, and most of the people in Bahrain, they are actually not in support of the regime. So they were confused basically in the initial stage. They didn't know what to
position, and instead of support the people, support the ruling family and what they are doing and dictatorship, or I have to find the sequences out of it. And I knew from the beginning this is a roadmap that I drew it for myself to continue at the end, stand for my democratic values and beliefs. So they took me to the military court, they took me to the civil court, and earlier they attacked my house twice by cocktail Molotov, and all was the clear messages, but I was resisting all this.
Could you identify the sides? Because I read reports where they were masked people, they were civilians, they weren't even in military uniform or police uniform.
Yes. It was, for example, a clear indication that one torturer was member of the ruling family, because all these soldiers used to call him Sheikh, and it is the title of the ruling family members that the Sheikh should be from ruling family, that he wanted.
A royal family member involved in this?
Yes,
in
clearly.
Abducting a
It
citizen.
was a military camp, a military prison where I've been taken, been tortured, and he put his gun over my head, and they started beating me, and he threatened me even to put electrical shock if he wants me, you know, to admit that I am agent of Iran, for example, and so on. So at the end, I found out I've been targeted. It happens constantly after I've been freed, and this thanks to the Bassiouni's activities and his team when they came to Bahrain, and they issued their reports, and I've been freed. With the rest, they didn't free me, but just they took my case to the court. And I got a chance to travel here to the UK for just a short visit, where suddenly I heard that they announced in the TV a statement, a single statement announced by the Minister of Interior that there are 31 citizens, their nationality has been revoked without any trial, without any evidence, without any reasons. And it was so surprised because next day my verdicts of the court was being announced. The court announced that the verdict that I should be in the jail for 15 months, the sentence for 14 months. So it was so contradicting.
Welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate looking into events that matter in the Middle East from multiple angles. This is what many censored media outlets couldn't achieve, and this is why we've come up with this show. Joining us at the studio today is Mr. Jawad Fayrouz, former Bahraini MP. Also with us is Mr. Jonathan Fryer, British politician and writer. We will be joined over the phone later by Dr. Ali Al-Faraj. So let's start our discussion with Mr. Jawad Fayrouz. Mr. Jawad, welcome to the show, first of all.
Thank you.
And you're a well-known opposition figure, ex-MP in Bahrain. And along with the 29 other Bahraini citizens, you had your Bahraini citizenship revoked. The same applied to your brother Jalal Fayrouz, also ex-Bahraini MP. So tell us briefly about the circumstances that led to this, and how could this be assessed from a legal perspective when it comes to revoking someone's citizenship in Bahrain?
Thank you for inviting me in your program. And I think, unfortunately, this is the case whenever you are living in a dictatorship regime, like Bahraini regime, that even you are ex-MP or you are being elected for more than 10 years. For my case, for example, I was elected councillor for 4 years, then MP for more than 6 years. But even though when the uprising in Bahrain started with the Arab Spring, especially in 14 February 2011, a couple of months, I was being detained, tortured, and they took me to the military court. And at the end, I found myself that's either I have to be loyal to the regime and accept the dictatorship, or I have to stand with my beliefs and my peoples for their freedom, for the democracy, and so on.
So you had the choice.
I had the choice, and I think in detention center, this was clear that a message from them, either I have to change my